In the least surprising turn of events, Zoran Mamdani, the communist mayor of New York City, has run out of money. Have you ever heard the expression that hard times create hard men create good times create soft men, and soft men create hard times? Well, Zoran is soft. I remember he couldn't bench 135 pounds without assistance. Soft men look at a system and decide that even though it brought incredible success to the people, they can do it better. So they dream up expensive and unwieldy government programs and squander the wealth generated by the capitalist system, and then they look around at the hardships they created and blame everyone else. Zoran, when your programs bankrupt New York City and cause the wealth creators to flee across the country, remember, it is because capitalism failed. It's because your socialist ideas are childish and you're half as clever as you think you are. I'm Tyler Chrestman. Welcome to the Chrestman Conversation. Hello, everyone. Okay, we have three topics we're going to go over today. We are going to talk about Zoran Mamdani running out of money in New York City already, as though we couldn't predict that was going to happen. We're going to talk about Jesse Jackson's legacy, and then we're going to talk about the detransitioner lawsuit that might change the way we treat transgenderism here in the United States. But before we get into that, let's do my favorite comment from last week. Favorite comment comes from Ruperter Skin 2117. Ruperter Skin? I have no idea. Said, quote, sure, they have a First Amendment right, and we also have a right to veto their funding when they start with their BS. Free speech versus professional responsibility to your sponsor. Not a tough call, really. And as you said, political propaganda is a violation of the Olympic rules, standards, and spirit. End quote. I agree 100%. That's exactly right. When we were talking about the Olympic athletes last week, we're talking about the ability to have rights versus doing the right thing. Those are sometimes in conflict. The fact that you have a right to do something doesn't mean that it's a good thing to do. You have a right to be an ass all the time. You can just be a jerk, and it doesn't mean it's the right thing to do. So anyway, thank you for the comment. I actually had a lot of really great comments on that episode last week, so I appreciate that from all of you. There were a lot of really well thought out comments, including the ones that disagreed with what I was saying. Some of them are very thought out. They weren't all just ad hominem nonsense. So I always appreciate that. And thank you for everyone who commented last week. Anyway, let's get right into it. Topic one, Zoran the socialist. Okay. Is anyone surprised that this is happening in New York City? I'm not surprised. Are you surprised? I'm not surprised. Zoran Mamdani, who is the newly elected mayor of New York City, he unveiled his budget for the next fiscal year. So that starts in July of this year. I don't know why we do it that way, but that's the way it works. So the budget has to come out and be approved and be set before July because the fiscal year goes July to July. Again, don't know why that's the case. It's just the way it is. So he put out the budget, and surprise, surprise, there isn't enough money to enact all of his programs, which seems insane to me. The budget that is proposed, that he put out for New York City, is $127 billion. There are 8 million people who live in New York City, which is basically the equivalent of spending about $16,000 per person in New York City on this budget. I want to just contrast that with the entire state of Florida. The entire state of Florida has a $115 billion budget, and they have 23 million people. So they got about 3 times the amount of people for less money. It's about $5,000 of spending per person. So it's 3 times less the amount of spending that they do in just the city of New York alone. So this budget that was proposed, which is bloated and disgusting and wasteful to the extreme, those are personal opinions. The budget is short by $5.4 billion. So they have a deficit of $5.4 billion. They do not know how they're going to pay for it. Initially, Zoran Mandani said, actually, it's $12 billion. And then he put out the budget, and it's actually closer to 5 than it is anything else, but 5.5, really. $5.5 billion. They just don't know where they're going to get it. So what's the solution? Well, Zoran Mamdani's got a solution for you, the mayor of New York City. His solution, obviously, is to increase taxes. Surprise, surprise again, as though no one could predict this. He said, well, we need more money to pay for all this free stuff. All the free stuff we have, we need more money for it. So all these free programs that I promised you, they cost us a lot of money, so we actually need more of your money to make them free. Obviously, that's how it works, because they're free for you guys, and you just have to pay us more money. So his solution is to increase property taxes. He's increasing property taxes by 9.5%. Just a humongous number. I mean, property taxes are ridiculous anyway, but this is, a gigantic increase. The city, by the way, has not increased property taxes since just after 9/11. I believe it was Bloomberg. And they raised them a ridiculous amount back then. It was 18%. This is coming from memory here. I think it was 18% that they raised in the couple years following 9/11. Whenever Bloomberg was elected, they had, a financial crisis in the city. They had to raise money. They increased property taxes by 18%. I don't know if it's been cut since then. I don't remember this. But anyway, his solution to raise all this money for all the free things is to increase property taxes. Now, I could just rant about property taxes. I probably will in a minute, actually, because I hate them so much. But this is not the only way that he's planning on paying for it. He also is going to raid the city's emergency funds. So he's taking money out of what they call the rainy day fund. So they have money stashed aside for emergencies. He's taking the emergency fund out. And he's also taking money out of the retiree healthcare reserves. So the government officials that they have to pay, basically the pension plan or the healthcare reserve plan for the pensioners of the city, he's just going to take the money from there. Now, they're not using it anyway, right? They don't need healthcare. We'll just take that money and use it to pay for all these things so we can give people free childcare and all these things. It's important to remember what Zoran Mamdani promised, because here's the trick for how socialists get elected. Socialists look at a system. So I'm going to try not to overly complicate this. We live in a system that is somewhat of a hierarchy. Now, there are good hierarchies and there are bad hierarchies. And we live in a pretty decent hierarchy. What I mean by this is we have a hierarchy based on meritocracy, which is a fine way to live, which means that for the most part, skillful people rise to the top and the people who aren't as skillful stay where they are or fall to the bottom. Now, there are people who are very skillful who fall to the bottom and people who are not so skillful who rise to the top. You can look at the morons on social media who manage to get wealthy being idiots, and you say, this just undercuts the idea of a meritocracy at all, because I'm pretty smart and I work a regular job, blah, blah, blah. So it's not a perfect system, but we live in a pretty decent system. And it's like Churchill said about democracy. Democracy's the worst system besides all the other, something like that. It's a poor paraphrase, but it basically is saying that we have a system. It's not perfect, but it's better than the rest of them. The idea of a meritocracy is a good idea. So we live in this system, and the hierarchy, the meritocracy that we live in, this system that we have designed, it has flaws. It's not perfect. And what the socialists do is they come in here and they look at a system that is incredibly successful at building wealth for everyone. So basically, you look at the poor people in America today, and they have a higher living standard than the richest people who have existed throughout history. They have a higher living standard. The poor people in America, the bottom 10%, have a higher living standard than a gigantic percentage of the rest of the world anywhere. So the poor people in America live better than rich people in other countries. That's a fact. And they live better than rich people throughout history. Now, this isn't everywhere. I'm not saying that the bottom 10% of America are living in luxury. That's not what I'm saying. What I'm saying is you have to have perspective and you have to be able to compare. What socialists do is they come in here and they identify something in the system. They say, well, look, there's poor people who exist, therefore the system's bad. And they say, no one should be poor. And you say, well, name me a society ever. But they don't do that. They just have to sit out there and point out the places where the system falls short. So they point to the poor, or they point to people who they can't afford their health care, or they say, oh, these people, they have this hardship that the government didn't fix, or the system designed, or that these are the victims of capitalism. And they identify these real issues, right? There are poor people who exist in a capitalist system. There are people who live on the street. There are homeless people who exist right now in America. And they look at these people and they say, see, the system's unfair because there's a victim. And they don't mention the fact that everyone in the capitalist system has risen, and capitalism has brought more people out of poverty than any system in history and increased the standard of living across the world where it's implemented. They don't mention all this because they point to very real people who are, I don't want to say victims of the system, but clearly are not thriving under the system. And they point to these people and they generate sympathy and empathy, and they make a point that is valid to some extent, but then their solution is to tear down the system that works for the 99% of people and implement these terrible policies that make everyone worse off. And so that's what Zoran does. That's what the socialists do. They look at a system that's not perfect and they say, well, it's not perfect, therefore it's terrible. And the answer is no, it's just not perfect. It works very well. It could be better in small ways. And maybe we can argue about social safety nets. But when Zoran was running for mayor, he wasn't interested in talking about that. He's talking about full-blown wealth redistribution. So this is a quote still up on his website from Zoran Mamdani's mayoral run. It says, quote, as mayor, Zoran will immediately freeze the rent for all stabilized tenants and use every available resource to build the housing New Yorkers need and bring down the rent. The number one reason working families are leaving our city is the housing crisis. The mayor has the power to change that. End quote. That is a direct quote from Zoran Mamdani's mayoral website. It's still up right now today if you go look at it. Raising property taxes is the opposite of this promise because he got in there and realized that all of the free things that he promised are not actually free. They cost money. He can't pay for them. He doesn't know how to pay for them. He doesn't know how to give you the quote-unquote free things that he promised you. So his solution is to raise taxes, which cost you money. Raising property taxes is the opposite of fixing the housing crisis. This makes it worse. You raise taxes on people who own property. What do you think the people who rent that property are going to have to do? They have to raise their prices to cover this so they don't lose money on the property. He's increasing the housing crisis in New York, the exact opposite of his number one promise on his website, which is to fix the housing crisis. Property taxes, now we're just going to get into it. Property taxes are the worst tax, in my opinion. There are tons of taxes I dislike. I don't like the income tax. But I don't have a problem with the income tax. I just have a problem with the income tax more so that it is unequally enforced. So I don't like the idea of some people paying more, some people paying less, some people paying nothing. I think that's ridiculous. I think if you want to have an income tax, that's fine. Just say we're going to have a 10% tax on everybody. Okay, I'm not opposed to this. I'm not opposed to taxes. All taxes, or I think all taxation is theft, although I think a lot of it is. Property tax being one. Property tax, the idea that I buy a house or a car and every year I have to pay the government for the privilege of owning that is absurd. That is a crazy thing to me. The fact that I own a house and every year the government comes and says, well, you give me $3,000 because you own that house. That's crazy. How did anyone think that property taxes were an okay thing to implement? Again, sales tax, okay, fine. The government wants a part of transactions. They have to raise revenue to pay for common good. I understand this. There has to be some form of taxation if you want to live in a government. I get that. There has to be some form. I think it should be minimal, but there has to be some. Again, an income tax, I'm not opposed to it as long as it's equally distributed. The same with the sales tax, as long as it's equally distributed across the board. Fine. These don't bother me. Property tax bothers me so much. It's crazy to me that I own my car. I don't have a loan on my car. I own it. I don't pay for my car. I own it 100%. Why am I giving the government $200 a year? It's not a lot. I'm not saying it's going to bankrupt me to pay whatever it is, $200 and something a year for my 10-year-old car that I own. But I have to pay them every year. And if I don't pay them, if I refuse to pay, I'm just going to go to prison because, you didn't pay your taxes, your $200 property tax. You got to go to prison. It's crazy. I don't understand it. So Zoran Mandani's not fixing anything. He's creating a worse problem. And he's hoping, right now, he's kind of playing a game of chicken, I think. He's hoping that the governor of New York, Kathy Hochul, will raise taxes on the wealthy. This is how he has proposed to pay for it. He wants to raise taxes on the wealthy. Well, he can't do that as the mayor of New York. The legislature of New York could do that. And he's hoping that they bail him out of the problem he created by raising taxes on the wealthy, which also won't work. Because it's important to remember, the wealthy pay all of the taxes. I don't know why people think this is not true. The top 50% of America, the earners, the top 50%, which are not wealthy people, by the way, but the top half pay all of the taxes. The bottom half of people in the country pay no net taxes. I want you to understand that. They pay zero. This is not controversial. This is not up for argumentation. This is absolutely 100% fact. The bottom 50% of the country do not pay taxes, net taxes to the government, meaning they take more in government assistance than they pay in taxes. The top 1% of people, the top 1% of earners, those incredibly wealthy people who they don't pay their fair share. They pay 30% of all of the taxes in the United States. 30%. The top 1% of people pay 30%. The top 10% pay 40%. So you include the top 10% of earners, they're paying 40% of all of the taxes in the country. I mean, the idea that the wealthy don't pay their fair share is crazy. And it's just something that sounds good to uneducated people. They go, oh, the wealthy, those rich people, they don't pay taxes. That's absolutely not true. Absolutely 100% not true. So the governor said she's not going to do this. She's not going to bail him out. So Zoran's in a bad position. He's going to raise taxes, which of course was going to happen. We all knew that was going to happen. I never doubted that for a second. Everyone else seemed to think it was going to be fine. But of course, the socialist gets in there and wants to give you free things. They got to raise taxes. Where is this money going is the big question. New York, well, the state of New York has a law. They capped classroom size. In high school, it is 25 people. And in elementary school and middle school, I believe it was 20 people. But they made a cap on classroom size. So they've said, we're only going to have 25 people per classroom. Well, New York has to find 6,000 additional teachers to fill that mandate. New York City has to hire 6,000 teachers, which is an incredible amount. The budget to reduce classroom size is $543 million. And it goes up to almost $1 billion each of the next 3 years, just reducing classroom size. It might be easier, though, for him because it turns out that there has been a net drop in students. So despite the fact that the budget is ballooning, the students in New York City, the number of first graders dropped from 87,000 10 years ago to 70,000 today. We've had a 17,000 person decrease in the amount of first graders over the course of a decade because people are fleeing New York City and they're turning to private institutions that the government doesn't fund. There is a way to fix this problem, which is the fact that many schools in New York City they don't have enough children, and you need to close them is what you need to do and consolidate some of the schools. I believe some of them were saying they have entire schools open for less than 100 people in New York City, or that half of the building is empty and they're holding school in one half of the building. Close those buildings and consolidate the buildings and have schools that are fully functioned, and you'll save, I saw something that said billions of dollars a year just consolidating schools in New York City. I get it. People are going to have to spend more time busing, and that's unfortunate. But the reality is if there's not enough people for the school, close the school. And they'd say billions of dollars. They're not going to do that, though. Mamdani has rejected that idea, the obvious practical one. Eric Adams had a policy in place. So does anyone remember when you had the governors of Florida and Texas shipping illegal immigrants to sanctuary cities? So this policy never really stopped. The governor of Texas, to all his credit, continues to ship illegal immigrants, or did for a long time. I think under Trump, obviously, the amount of illegals crossing the border. But he never really stopped doing that. It fell out of the news, but the governor of Texas kept that policy in place. Eric Adams had to deal with this. And part of the way they dealt with it was he made a 30-day migrant housing policy. I was trying to think of the word there. Policy. So basically it said that migrants who were coming through the city could stay 30 days in shelter, and then they either had to find a place or they were going to be shipped out somewhere else. All right, and they would facilitate that. Well, Mamdani, the first thing he did in office is strip this off. So the migrants who they would be shipped to New York, or they would come to New York, and they had to either find lodging of their own, or they were going to be shipped off somewhere else, basically. And he stopped this. So the migrant population, the population in the United States of illegal immigrants, or in the New York City of illegal immigrants, they basically had this trending downward effect. So they would be shipped in, they would be able to show, they'd stay here for 30 days, they were shipped out, or less than 30 days, and they were shipped out. So it was kind of this up and down wavy pattern. Well, Mamdani, he rescinded the policy of a 30-day thing and made it indefinite. You could just stay. You can just stay as long as you need because it's the nice thing to do. Well, the migrant population has not dropped at all. Less than 1,000 people have exited the shelters in the last month, which again is almost nothing, an insignificant amount. There's 31,000 migrants currently in shelters in New York City, and it was 31,000 and some change at the beginning of the month. They're not shipping anybody out. They are, again, it's a crisis of his own making. But anyway, I'm interested to see how this shakes out. We're going to do a follow-up story on this when we figure out exactly if he's going to have to raise these taxes or if they're going to cave in the government and fund his crazy agenda. I doubt that they will. But this is what New Yorkers get. You voted for this clown. He's going to fail. He was always destined to fail. And it's going to be sad, but you get what you vote for. And New York City brought this on themselves. He doesn't know what he's doing. The idea, he's a guy who gets in there promising you free candy. And then he gets in there and figures out, oh, we can't afford candy. Here's your stale bread. That's what Zoran Mandani, that's every socialist who's ever elected. They want to take all of the wealth generated by capitalism, say the system's terrible, confiscate that wealth, and then use it till it runs out, and then go, oh, we don't have any idea how to actually run a system. We're just great at taking other people's money. So, New York, you get what you paid for. Anyway, let's move on here because we're already at 20 minutes. All right, topic 2, the legacy of Jesse Jackson. Jesse Jackson passed away this week. I'm sure most of you know who Jesse Jackson is, and we don't want to talk ill of the dead, but I think he's an important political figure, and it's important we talk about the good and the bad. So he was famous. He was very young, but he marched with Martin Luther King Jr., was sort of one of the inner confidants of MLK, which obviously right there is a legacy. Just to have been around that man and important enough to be considered part of the inner circle, it's amazing. He lied a little bit. He was there when Martin Luther King Jr. was shot. There was some controversy, I believe, when he was running for president that he lied about. He said that he actually held Martin Luther King Jr. in his arms. He cradled him while he died. And that turned out to not be true. Again, he's a little bit of a self-aggrandizer. He exaggerates just a bit and wants to play up his importance. But still, he was there when Martin Luther King Jr. was shot. He just didn't do the things that he said he did. But he was an important figure in civil rights, and you can't take that away from him. And I think the most important thing he did was in, I would say, 1984. Probably the 1984 presidential election. He ran for president. And this was a big deal because he was a big figure. And you listen to, I heard Jason Riley earlier this week. If you don't know who Jason Riley is, you should check out his work. He's great. But I heard Jason Riley earlier this week talk about how important that was as Jason Riley, as a black man, to see this black man run for president, and how that really was important for people because this was the 80s, so you're talking a long time ago at this point. And you had this black man who was inspiring. You had a lot of young black people who apparently worked on his campaign, and I do feel like that was important in the representation that this person was a serious contender, not just some guy running for any other reason other than he really wanted to be president, and people took him seriously, and it was a big deal for Black America. You know, the way that it was electing Barack Obama was a big deal for America, and this idea that it was kind of an important progress or a step, just because, again, at the time when I voted for Obama in 2008, it was kind of this idea that we were entering a post-racial America, which I love the idea of that. It turned out to be incredibly false, but it was this idea that Barack Obama is smart, he's articulate, he's obviously I don't believe with a lot of his politics today, but he was a person that you could look to and you say, it's inspiring, this idea of how far we've come as a country. Well, Jesse Jackson was that in the 80s, this idea that we've come far in the country. 20 years after the Civil Rights Act of 1964, you had this guy running for president who was inspiring, and it was great. The problem for Jesse Jackson, and the problem I think that his legacy is going to have, is what happened after this. He was one of these guys, the nicest way I can think to say it is a race hustler. That's what he was. And just like Al Sharpton, he was a shakedown artist after his presidential run. And he did something that I think is incredibly immoral and bad, which is that he'd find the corporations, and he would criticize these corporations. And he would do so publicly, and he would just make it seem like they were racist, or he'd find some dirt or something, and he would basically, he would shake down these corporations. He would just talk about them, criticize them, until they paid his company to basically just stop. His solution, we used to call this extortion or blackmail, but that's what he would do. He would basically go out and say companies were racist. He would find people in the company who would basically turn against the company, say they were racist, and he would just criticize until they gave him a bunch of money. He got incredibly wealthy doing this, and I think that's a bad thing. Again, I think fighting racism is great. I think being a corporate shakedown artist and fomenting racial division through extortion is a bad thing. And I think Jesse Jackson did that. And I think that it is a part of his legacy that really doesn't do him any justice. It is something that I think you're going to look back on and say that he was one of these divisive figures that actually was bad for the country, because this racial division doesn't happen organically. I really don't believe that. I don't think on the street white and black people interact with each other every day and just had issues. When I was younger, it was better, which is crazy to me. White, black, it didn't really matter when I was a teenager nearly as much as it matters now that I'm in my 30s. And I think that that's insane. We've gone backwards. And I think he's part of that problem. This idea that there's some deep-seated racial animus among the white community towards black people in 2026. It comes from people like Jesse Jackson and Al Sharpton. And the big difference is, when you look back on his legacy, is he was the civil rights movement of the 60s was for one thing. And it was an incredibly laudable goal, and it was noble, and it was good, which is that racism is bad. If you don't agree with that, we're not on the same team. We're not on the same team. Racism is bad, and what black people need is equality of treatment and opportunity, meaning that they shouldn't be discriminated against. They should have the equal ability to apply for jobs, go to schools. They should have equal treatment to their white compatriots. This is something I believe 99.9% of people believe, that you shouldn't discriminate people based on race, or used to believe, at least. I don't know if I could say that anymore. Jesse Jackson didn't believe in equal treatment. He believed in special treatment. And this is where the division comes from. I believe in equal treatment. I do not believe in special treatment. I think you could make an argument in the 60s for things like affirmative action, which is to say that we're going to put quotas on a company, and you're going to say you have to hire this many black people, or you have to hire this many women, or you have to do this. I could see the argument for it in the 60s when you say we are coming out of an incredibly racist period, and we need schools to admit black people, we need jobs to hire black people, we're going to make them do these things. Because forced integration had to happen in certain parts of the country. Okay, I get that. I get the argument for it in the 60s. Fast forward 60 years, there's no good argument for it. We've seen the effects of affirmative action. They were bad for the black community. I don't know how else to say that. They were bad. Look at Thomas Sowell has written extensively about this. Read anything written by Thomas Sowell about this problem. We could talk about college admissions and how affirmative action at colleges has harmed the black community in so many ways. And Jesse Jackson was one of these people who believed in special treatment. And I think that it was part of the division that came post-civil rights. So what you see is this racial cohesion happening where America's racist, slavery, bad, obviously. Then you have Jim Crow, terrible. But what happens under Jim Crow is that more and more white people think Jim Crow is bad. So the racial cohesion of white and black trends upward, which is how you get the civil rights movement. The civil rights movement didn't happen because black people alone stood up to white oppression. It happened because white people looked at the treatment of their black citizens and said, well, this is abhorrent. This is something we can't tolerate. And white people helped generate the civil rights movement. You look at the marches, they're not just black faces, because nothing would have happened. If a small percentage of the population is just hated by everyone, it doesn't matter. They get crushed. It's because the public sentiment turned, and the majority of the country wanted civil rights, which means the majority of white people wanted civil rights. So you see this racial cohesion that happens where the white community and the black community are growing together, basically. And then post-civil rights, it goes up and up and up, and then there's a division that happens again. And you see this racial animosity begin to happen. I would put it around the 2010, somewhere around there. You really see this where it starts in sort of academia and it divides. And it all comes back to this idea of equal treatment and special treatment, and the difference between equality of opportunity and equality of outcome. So it has a political nature and it has an organic nature that caused this rift between the white and the black community to happen as I've gotten older, which is just, I find it gross, but it's part of, again, a person like Jesse Jackson. It's part of his legacy, and it's an unfortunate part because he did a lot of good, I think, but also it's bad. Anyway, we could do a whole episode on equality of opportunity versus equality of outcome, but this is just about Jesse Jackson, so we're not going to do that. Anyway, let's get on to topic 3. Talk about this detransitioner lawsuit. So we're not going to use names. I'm just going to use ages. Oh, hello, Winnie. Come up here. Nope, she just wants to yell. We're just going to use ages because I don't want to, it's not important about the specific person we're talking about because we're going to see a lot of these. But basically, a 22-year-old woman has been awarded $2 million in damages by a jury. And the case found that both the plastic surgeon and the psychiatrist who treated her were liable for damages. So the case, a little details of the case. This girl was 16 years old, had a double mastectomy. Later, she realized that she was in fact not trans and regretted the decision and decided to bring a lawsuit against the people who performed it on her. Her mother testified during the trial that she didn't want her daughter to have a double mastectomy, but she consented out of fear that her daughter would commit suicide. This is something that Abigail Schreier talks about a lot. It's this idea that you get told by medical professionals, well, you got to do this, or your son or your daughter is going to kill themselves. And she said that that's what she was told by the psychiatrist, that basically her daughter was going to kill herself if she didn't have surgery to cut off her breasts. And so you're basically being bullied or shamed by this so-called medical professional to get this brutal surgery. The surgery took place in December of 2019. Now, here's the part where the jury found them liable. By the way, the jury was not ruling on whether transgender surgery was appropriate. The jury was ruling on whether in this particular case they didn't follow all the proper procedures. In December of 2019, this young girl, 16 years old, had a double mastectomy. This is less than 5 months after a psychiatrist noted that she had questions about her gender. 5 months it took by. This plastic surgeon, or as I like to call him, a butcher, named Simon Chin, had two 30-minute appointments with this woman before cutting off her breasts. So less than an hour of time this person spent with this young 16-year-old girl before saying, yeah, I'll cut your breasts off. That's fine. The whole thing happened in less than a year. So this person began having mental issues, and it was from the time that they decided to go and see a psychiatrist, it was less than a year, it was 11 months later, that they had their breast cut off. It's crazy to me. So you're talking, at the time, they were probably 15 years old, right? 15 years old, 11 months later, 16 years old, had your breast cut off. A 15-year-old girl with mental health issues, which, I'm not trying to be rude here, is a lot of 15-year-old girls. That's a lot of teenage girls have issues. A lot of boys do too. They manifest differently. Girls turn their neurotic tendencies inward. Boys turn them outward, meaning that girls self-harm and boys harm others. That's kind of the way it works, especially in teenagers. And so this girl who's having problems goes to a psychiatrist, and in less than a year goes from being a girl with mental health issues to a boy, quote unquote, a boy who then a year later goes back to being a girl. This is terrible. This is absolutely malpractice. And the whole thing happening in less than a year is what the jury said, well, that just seems wrong. It seems weird that a plastic surgeon would meet with a teenager and in less than an hour of time spent with her, decide, yeah, I'll cut her breasts off. Life-altering surgery for this teenager. I hope that this has a chilling effect on these monsters who are doing this to children. I do. I say this because of people like this woman. The idea that what we're doing is good for children and we're going to allow them to make life-altering decisions as children is insane. It is absolutely insane to me. And I don't understand why we're okay with it. Again, I am all for... What? What the heck? Winnie, say hi. Winnie, you got anything to say for yourself? No? All right. She's shy today. I am all for it. I don't want anyone to suffer. I don't want anyone to feel bad. I don't want anyone to have mental health issues. I am all for helping people as we need to. But the science, the quote unquote science behind transgender surgery for children is terrible. Nobody thinks that this is a good idea. The medical institutes that tout this behavior, they are not basing this on science, because all you have to do is look at the rates of suicidality among people pre and post-op transgender surgery. They do not change. The mental health outcomes of people who transition are no better than people who do not transition. And the amount of people who detransition is growing rapidly, because what we're doing is we're funneling people into this space where we say, well, obviously, the best way to treat transgenderism is to just embrace it. The science that says that embracing transgenderism is good for people is scant to non-existent. There's nothing that is settled that says a 15-year-old who says, I have gender dysphoria, what should be called rapid onset gender dysphoria, which means that you don't display any characteristics of this and then you say you do and then rapidly change. There's no science that says this is good. If you can find it, please send it to me. I've read these studies. I've read the CAST report. Have you seen any of the things that have come out about this? And what I've heard, what I've seen when you listen to interviews with people like Chloe Cole or anything like this, you'll see they knew immediately it was wrong. But they felt like, oh, all these adults around me are telling me that this is a good thing. You go online and you get encouragement from adults. Yeah, you're absolutely right. This is definitely the best thing for you. Be yourself. Be authentically you. Blah, blah, blah. And then they have the surgery, and less than a year later, they go, oh, this was a terrible idea. I had my breasts cut off. Why did I do this? I had my I don't want to get too graphic. I had my penis cut and inverted. And I woke up without it, and I said, oh, this was immediately a mistake. That is the saddest thing in the world, that someone struggling with mental health is led down this path to hell from some butcher, and we're just supposed to pretend that it's the compassionate, empathetic thing to do. I don't believe that. You think I'm motivated by any animosity towards somebody who's suffering or says they're trans? I don't have anything against people who are trans. What I'm saying is I want them to be happy and healthy. I do not see any evidence that this is the best way to do that. And we're just supposed to pretend it is, based on nothing. This poor girl, led by a feckless mom and two butchers who said the best thing that she could do is cut off her genitalia. Okay, no. $2 million is not enough. 10 million, 100 million. Bankrupt those people. Send them to prison. I don't know. I think this should have a chilling effect, and I hope it does. Good. It should have a chilling effect. I hope every physician out there who did surgery on a minor who later regrets the surgery has to come back and face a jury and give up all that wealth that they accumulated chopping body parts off kids. I hope that they all do. I don't know. We'll see. There's something like 22 or 30. I can't remember. There's a giant number of these lawsuits going forward right now. Again, the most famous one being Chloe Cole. And I hope they all win. I hope all of these doctors wind up in the poorhouse with their medical license through a shredder. And they're not allowed to practice, and they got to go live in some soup kitchen with the rest of the bums out there that, a whole shelter full of former doctors who don't have any money and are forced to live in rags. That's what I hope. It would be too much for them because it should be prison. But anyway, we're going to leave it there for the day. As always, people, questions, comments, concerns, leave them in the comments down below. I feel like I was really ranty today, wasn't I? I feel a little ranty. I hope you guys enjoyed it. Anyway, I hope you guys have a great week. I'm going to catch you next Friday.